Hello, it's Michelle Morand here, and we're going to talk today about part three of our intuitive eating segment of this course. Today, we're going to talk about what normal eating is. What does it actually look like? What does it actually mean? And I'm going to give you a little experiment to start playing around with today, just to start to figure out what that might look and feel like for you. And then tomorrow we're going to go into even more detail about some of the steps that people who eat normally do without even thinking about it. That rare creature that you might have in your world who eats what they want, doesn't really think about it, doesn't seem to have a weight problem. Well, how do they do that? Well, we're going to talk about step by step what they do and how you can start to do that too. For today, though, we're going to set that up for you and give you again a starter exercise to begin experimenting with. So, what is normal eating? Normal eating is really, if we're talking about it from a disordered eating perspective, simply is eating when you're hungry, stopping when you're full, allowing all things in moderation, presuming you're not allergic and they're not going to harm you in some way. And really, that's pretty much it. Waiting until you're hungry to eat, stopping when you're comfortably full, all things in moderation, and really not thinking or focusing much on food other than the enjoyment of the taste and the well being that it brings you. So, normal eating could also be referred to as intuitive eating, listening to the cues of your body about hunger and fullness, a term that was used a lot 30 years ago when I first started working in this field was natural eating, which now, when I Google it, really seems to be used to represent. More veganism or vegetarian cooking. Hence, I'm not using that term, but if you're familiar with my work, then that is what we're referring to here when we think about normal eating or intuitive eating. Okay, so let's go over those criteria again. Uh, if you're eating naturally or normally or intuitively, what you're doing is you're waiting until you're hungry to have something to eat. Okay, so the flip side of that, as somebody in recovery from binge eating, is that if you know you're not hungry and you're wanting to have something to eat, that's not what a normal or natural or intuitive eater would do, except every now and then with snacky stuff and having a craving or two. I use the example of popcorn at the movies. So very few people are actually hungry for that, but every now and then, again, in moderation, it's no big deal. It doesn't add to our bottom line in a negative way, and it's an enjoyable, fun thing to do. Or like going out for an ice cream after a meal or something like that. Again, rarely are we hungry for those things, but in moderation, there's no consequence to doing so. It's when you're doing those things frequently. And that, of course, is why you're here, is because you're finding yourself eating more than you're hungry for and not feeling like you're in control of how much you have or the choices that you're making. Um, so we wait if we're intuitively eating. If we're eating normally, we're going to wait until we're hungry to eat, and we're going to be paying attention to how we're feeling physically in our body as we're eating. And I don't mean that we have to stop and practice a mindfulness exercise with every bite. I just mean that we're paying attention to general signals, and we'll talk more about these tomorrow, but signals like maybe shifting our body. Oftentimes when our physical form, not necessarily our instinctive brain or emotional self, has had enough, when our body has had enough, oftentimes there'll be a sigh or an exhalation. Something to look for. Maybe pay attention to that today as you go. That's a sign that, okay, I can stop now. A lot of times, if we're binge eating, we're eating way past that sign. What I'm trying to say here is, even if you feel very disconnected from your body's cues of hunger and fullness, or you don't feel that you can trust them, very likely your body is sending you some messages that let you know when it's reached that satiation point versus the overfull or stuffed point that you're probably a lot more familiar with. So we want to be present in our body while we're eating so that we can notice those cues as we're starting to get full. And maybe we set the rest of the food aside. Maybe we tell ourselves something like, I can have that later if I want, or I'm just going to set it there for 10 minutes and see if I still want something. But we will pay attention to those cues if we're eating intuitively. Also, intuitive eaters have a general gist of what a healthy diet contains. And I hate using that word diet, frankly, when we're talking about natural eating or intuitive eating, because the word diet has such negative connotations for those of us who, have struggled in the past or are still struggling with binge eating. Um, Really, the term diet simply means what you eat. However, since the 70s, that word has just been totally taken over by the diet industry. And so you don't use that word except to imply restriction. And so it does have that connotation to it. Um, However, we're talking about intuitive eating, a nice, healthy relationship with food. And a part of that requires us to understand what healthy nutritional content looks like. So, what does a healthy diet look like? We know that it looks like a good portion of fruit and vegetable. We know that lean proteins are important, that natural carbohydrates or complex carbohydrates, you might be familiar with them as, versus processed carbohydrates like pastas and white breads. Um, would be ideal, and that we would be having natural sugars in our diet, like those that are naturally occurring in fruits, for example, as opposed to refined sugars. Again, what I've just done here is given you a general gist, a hint in the direction of what we want to be having to provide our body with the most nutrition, and with those foods that are going to help us to maintain that dopamine and oxytocin in a stable way, as opposed to give us that mood roller coaster that the processed carbs and sugars and fatty foods do. When I say fatty foods, I mean trans fats, like in fast foods. I don't mean nuts and oils and things like that that are healthy for us. So if I'm eating intuitively, I've got a sense of what a healthy diet looks like. And for the most part, I am leaning towards those choices: fruits, veg, complex carbohydrates, and lean proteins. And I'm making foods that I really enjoy, or I'm having foods that I really enjoy the taste of, so that I get the enjoyment from the food. And I also am having those foods that, again, don't cause those dopamine spikes or those insulin spikes that really affect my mood and my energy. And of course, I'm putting foods into my body that my body can really use. And therefore, the foods I'm putting in don't get stored in these little fat cells that become cellulite, and ultimately are like toxin stores in my body, that as life goes on have a higher likelihood of leading to things like diabetes and cancer. So there's a lot of benefit to overall having a healthy diet. And I understand I'm preaching to the choir here. And I just want you to have a sense of the general gist. We don't need to be militant about it. And probably the less you focus on micromanagement in terms of weighing and measuring things, the absolute better for you, unless you have severe sensitivities of some kind. And instead, really, let's just focus on the general gist of steering towards these choices, not militantly, not all or nothing. We're interested in a full life, and really focusing on, am I truly physically hungry right now, or not really, as the determinant of whether I'm going to eat? And then focusing on, have I had any of those fullness cues, those satiation cues, and therefore should I stop now? Those are the two biggest pieces. Am I hungry? Am I full? Again, I appreciate that's going to take some time. Your trust in yourself Your trust in your body's cues has almost certainly been somewhat, if not entirely, compromised by your efforts to manage your relationship with food through dieting. It's the best way to alienate yourself from yourself. So there's going to be a little bit of work to do to work back from that disconnect into really hearing and trusting that you can read those signs well. And then from there, there's a little bit of work to actually following those signs, because there's always a little bit of pushback, a little uncertainty, and still just some of that habit that we talked about before. But really, typically, it takes just a couple of weeks of people to work with these tools I'm sharing with you today and will share with you tomorrow, to start to have confidence that you can genuinely tell, I am hungry, I am full, and you're able to respond more appropriately to those sensations. It's also really good from an intuitive eating perspective to appreciate what we've been talking about in the previous few videos, which is how food affects your mood. You have so much power over how you feel, emotionally and physically. Again, with all due respect to people who have chronic illnesses and other things going on, you do have so much power over how you feel, how much energy you have, and that has a lot to do with your self-care. I know that sounds like a dirty word sometimes because that can be wielded as a judgment against us. Um, but really, when I'm talking about self-care, I'm talking about making decent choices around your nutrition. I'm talking about making sure you get decent sleep, that you're staying hydrated, and that you're moving your body for at least about 20 minutes a day in some way, shape, and form. If you've just groaned or want to press the off button right now, just take a deep breath and know that I'm not saying you have to do all that right away. And everything that we're going to be doing together in our work together is leading us towards a very compassionate approach to our self-care, so that those things will be doable. Even if you feel like you can't get to bed until 3 in the morning and you haven't exercised in 5 years and all of those things, not to worry. There are reasons for each of those things. My job is to help you identify what those reasons are. And frankly, if going to bed at 3 o'clock is truly right for you, once you've really examined why you're making that choice and how that factors into the rest of your life, then you'll know that and you'll feel peaceful about that. There won't be judgment, there won't be shame, and you'll be using your time wisely. And if that isn't the case, then you'll know that and you'll have the information and the energy you need to make some changes. So we're back to one of our early lessons about the importance of being curious, taking the time to notice. Right now, as we're talking about just paying attention to whether you're hungry or not, really, what comes up? Do you feel like, oh, screw that, that's the last thing I want to do, or that's not going to help, or if I do that, then I won't be able to eat, right? These are all, these are all thoughts I've had, and they're all thoughts I've heard hundreds of times, and so you're human. You're normal. We're talking about changing a pattern of behavior that, even though it has some really negative consequences and causes you a lot of stress, as we've already talked about, it also meets a lot of needs. So a way that I like to think about it is good old Linus from Peanuts, who's walking around with his little security blanket. We're not going to take Linus's blanket away. That would be cruel. What we are going to do is we're going to provide Linus with enough other options that are meeting the need that the blanket meets, that he could start to set the blanket down sometimes, and that he could ultimately decide to leave the blanket behind and go do these things because they're more fun and don't require him to carry a dirty, smelly blanket around. So for us, our blankie is food. And while it has a lot of immediate benefits in terms of how quickly it adjusts our brain chemistry and helps us to numb and soothe ourselves, it has also some fairly immediate negative consequences. And my job is to help you to remember both of those things. There's no shame in thinking about having something to eat if you're not hungry. There's no shame in contemplating that choice. Where, if we want to use that word shame, where that lies is in ignoring yourself, in forgetting that that cue to eat when you're not hungry is actually you saying, I'm overwhelmed. I need a time out. Something is too much and I just need a break. To respond to those signals to use food to cope with judgment or shame is kind of ignoring that fact. And in fact, it's kind of berating somebody who's needing help. And that's nothing I'm sure you would do to anybody out there in the world. And I really urge you to please stop doing that to yourself if that fits. Okay, so the foods you eat affect your mood. You're still going to allow everything in moderation. There is no concept of good versus bad. You have a general gist of what a healthy diet contains. We've just kind of run through that. I don't want you to be thinking in terms of quantity and amounts. I want you to be thinking in terms of, how am I feeling? Am I physically hungry? And am I comfortably full? And I understand that what I've just laid out for you may feel like a lot or impossible, and not to worry, because that's what I'm here for, is to walk you through that. Today we're just talking about the kind of the bullet points of what we're going to be learning to do. So all I want you to do today is I just want you to just observe. If you were to say, okay, for today, I just want to try an experiment. And the experiment is I'm going to try to steer myself towards waiting until I'm hungry to eat. Notice how you just felt when I said that. How stressful was that thought? And maybe just stop and ask yourself what you're telling yourself about that that's causing you to feel distressed. What's going to happen? What's going to not happen? Just notice that tension. That right now, as much as you're here, you've paid to be here. You want to be here. You want change. And as much as that's so true for you, there's still a part of you that's very fearful, that's nervous about change, nervous about letting go of that security blanket, and also just doesn't want to set ourselves up, or doesn't want to set yourself up for trying something that isn't going to work. And I absolutely empathize. I get it. So we're just going to gather some data today. We're not going to do anything any differently, but I just want you to observe, be honest with yourself about the nervousness that you have, about the resistance, about the uncertainty. Because if you're not going to be honest with yourself about that, you should probably go back and start the program again, or just come back when you're ready. Okay, because the most important thing, as we've talked about since day one, is you building a relationship of trust with yourself, of you having the courtesy to be at least slightly curious about why you're feeling so overwhelmed, or why having food when you know you're not hungry feels like a good idea. That is critical. So today I just want you to observe and gather data. When I just think about waiting to eat until I am hungry and stopping when I'm comfortably full, what comes up? What do I imagine that looking like? What is going to happen? What gets in the way of you thinking about giving that a try, or what feels like, okay, I really want to go for that? Just make a note of that. That's all I want you to do today, is just be honest with yourself about the stuff that feels kind of exciting maybe about that, and the stuff that concerns you about that, and the stories that you're telling yourself about how that's going to go. Okay, the more transparent you can be with yourself, the more honest you can be with yourself, the easier every part of your life will be moving forward. So I'll see you tomorrow, and we'll work through the steps of how a normal eater eats without even thinking about it, and I'm going to help to teach you how to do that. Okay, so you have a good day. Just observe, make some notes, be honest with yourself. Take care.